Before the skyscrapers of glass, before the airport that moves more human beings than any other place on earth, there was a wooden stake driven into the red clay of a Georgia ridge. No ocean, no great harbor, not even a proper river within walking distance. Nothing that a great city is supposed to be built upon. Only the end of a railroad line marked in the middle of a forest clearing, 7 miles from a slow brown river. They called the place Terminus because that is what it was. The end of the line. And within a single lifetime, an army would burn its heart to cinders and leave it steaming in the November rain. This is the story of how that nothing place refused to die and rose to rule the entire American South. To understand Atlanta, you have to understand that it was never meant to be beautiful. It was meant to be useful. In the 1830s, the state of Georgia looked at a map and saw a problem. The interior of the country was opening, and Georgia had no way to reach it. So in 1836, the legislature authorized a state-owned railroad to run north toward Chattanooga, Tennessee, and into the markets beyond. The following year, engineers walked out along a ridge in the upper Piedmont and drove a stake into the ground to mark where the line would end. That stake, later set in stone, became known as the 0-mile post. Everything that Atlanta would ever become radiates outward from that single, unremarkable point. But the land where they drove that stake was not empty, whatever the boosters would later claim. It had belonged to the Cherokee and the Muskogee peoples who were forced from northwest Georgia in those same years, pushed west along roads that would later be remembered with grief. The clearing in the forest was made. It did not simply exist. And it is worth pausing on that because Atlanta's whole story is a story of things built on top of what came before, of triumph laid over loss, again and again. At first there was almost nothing. A few houses, a store, a scattering of families living at the end of a rail line that barely ran. The settlement was so humble it went through names like a child trying on clothes. Terminus became Marthasville, named for a governor's daughter. Then, in 1845, a railroad engineer suggested something grander, something that sounded like the ocean the town would never touch: Atlanta. 2 years later, it was a chartered city. And then the thing that had no reason to exist began, quietly, to matter. Because railroads are not like rivers. A river goes where the land tells it to. A railroad goes where men decide. And men decided, over and over, to point their tracks at this one ridge. Between 1845 and the middle of the following decade, rail lines arrived from 4 different directions, and suddenly the little terminus was the knot where the South tied itself together. They started calling it the Gate City. Cotton moved through it. Goods moved through it. People moved through it. In a region of plantations and sleepy ports, Atlanta became something the Old South had very little of. A place built entirely on movement. There is a lesson buried in that, and Atlanta learned it early. A city on a river is a prisoner of its water. A city on a rail junction is only as important as the choices men keep making about where to lay their track. Atlanta had no coastline to defend and no harbor to lose. What it had was a decision, renewed year after year, that this ridge was the place where the South would meet itself. As long as that decision held, the town would grow. And it grew with a speed that unsettled the older, prouder cities around it, the ones with their antebellum mansions and their tidewater dignity. Atlanta had none of that. It had warehouses and hotels and the constant grinding of iron wheels, and it had the raw hunger of a place that knew it had been built on purpose rather than born of the land. That was its gift, and that gift was about to become a target. By the time the Civil War came, Atlanta had transformed itself into the arsenal of the Confederacy, second in importance only to the capital at Richmond. Its foundries made the iron. Its rails carried the guns and the grain and the men. If you wanted to break the Southern war effort, you did not have to defeat every army in the field. You only had to take this one city. And in the summer of 1864, a Union general named William Tecumseh Sherman understood that perfectly. The campaign for Atlanta ground on for weeks through the Georgia heat, and on the 2nd of September, 1864, the city fell. The news raced north and lifted a war-weary Union, helping to carry Abraham Lincoln to re-election that autumn. But Sherman knew he could not stay. His supply line stretched hundreds of miles behind him through hostile country, and he intended to cut himself loose from it and march to the sea. He could not leave a rebuilt arsenal at his back, so he made a decision that would haunt his name forever. He ordered the people out first. The families who remained, only a fraction of the 20,000 who had lived there, were expelled from their own homes and sent away. And then, in the middle of November, his engineers went to work. They tore down the brick and the stone with battering rams. They set fire to the wooden buildings of the business district, the depots, the factories, the machine shops, the rail yards that were the entire reason Atlanta existed. All of it was given to the flames. Here the legend and the record part ways, and the record is heavy enough without embellishment. The stories would later say the whole city was leveled, that nothing was left standing but chimneys and ash. That is not quite what happened. Historians now estimate that roughly 40% of Atlanta was destroyed. Sherman's orders spared homes and churches, though many burned anyway when unattended fires spread through the night. And much of the wreckage was not even his doing. The retreating Confederates had blown up their own ammunition and torn down houses to build fortifications long before he arrived. But do not let the corrections soften it too far. The heart of the city was gone. The very thing that made Atlanta Atlanta, the tangle of iron rails and the depots that fed them, lay twisted and melted in the cold. Whole streets were emptied of people and buildings alike. When Sherman marched away toward Savannah with 60,000 men, he left behind a hollowed, smoking ruin where a booming city had stood only months before. 2 out of every 5 buildings gone. The population scattered. The gate city had become a wound. And this is the moment where almost every other story would end. A place built on nothing, burned down to less than nothing. Its reason for existing reduced to slag. By every logic of geography, Atlanta should have simply faded into the pines, another southern town that the war had killed. Instead, something strange happened, something that explains everything Atlanta would become. The rails could not be moved. You can burn a warehouse. You can level a foundry. But you cannot pick up the geography of a rail network and carry it somewhere else. Those 4 lines still pointed at this one ridge because they had always pointed at this one ridge, and there was nowhere better for them to go. The reason Atlanta had been worth destroying was the exact same reason it could not stay destroyed. And so, almost before the embers had cooled, people came back to the end of the line and began to rebuild on top of the ashes. They rebuilt fast, faster than anyone had reason to expect. The rail depot went up again. A new commercial district rose out of the rubble. And in 1868, only a few years after the burning, the state of Georgia moved its capital to Atlanta, choosing it over the old capital precisely because of the railroads that converged there. The wound was becoming a seat of power. By the census of 1880, Atlanta had passed Savannah to become the largest city in the state. The place that had been reduced to cinders was now the beating center of Georgia. The city knew exactly what it had done, and it chose a symbol to match. In 1887, Atlanta adopted a new seal. On it was a phoenix, the mythical bird that burns to death and rises living from its own ashes, and beneath it a single Latin word: Resurgence. Rising again. There has rarely been a city so honest about what it believed itself to be. If you are finding this story worth your time, take a moment to subscribe. This channel exists to tell the histories of American places the way they deserve to be told, with the weight left in. Now, let us follow Atlanta out of the ashes and into a new kind of ambition. because the men rebuilding Atlanta did not simply want to restore what had been lost. They wanted something else entirely. They looked at the Old South, the world of cotton and plantations that the war had destroyed, and they decided they did not want it back. The loudest voice of that ambition belonged to a newspaper editor named Henry Grady of the Atlanta Constitution. Grady preached what he called the New South, a South that would build factories and mills and commerce instead of leaning forever on the soil. In a famous speech in New York, he stood before Northern businessmen and told them the old South of slavery and secession was dead and that a new one had been born from its grave. And he pointed to Atlanta as its living proof. But here, the elegy must be honest, because the New South carried a shadow as long as its promise. The prosperity that Grady sold was built to preserve the power of white men over black Southerners who had been freed by the war and were now being slowly, deliberately stripped of the rights that freedom had promised. In the very years Atlanta was rising, Georgia expelled its black legislators and rewrote its elections to shut black citizens out of power. The phoenix rose. But it did not rise for everyone, and the city's gleaming rebirth was laid, like everything else in Atlanta, directly on top of someone else's loss. Still, the machine of ambition kept turning, and in 1886, it produced something that would carry Atlanta's name farther than any railroad ever could. In a pharmacy downtown, a Confederate veteran named John Pemberton, a man who tinkered with medicines, mixed up a caramel-colored syrup meant to cure headaches. He carried a jug of it down the street to Jacob's Pharmacy, where they added carbonated water and sold it for 5 cents a glass. His bookkeeper gave it a name and wrote it out in a flowing script that has barely changed since: Coca-Cola. In its first year, it sold about 9 glasses a day. Pemberton would not live to see what he had made. Ailing and short of money, he sold the rights for a few $1,000s to another Atlanta businessman, Asa Candler, and died soon after. It was Candler, not the inventor, who turned a local tonic into an empire. But the drink stayed rooted in Atlanta, and it made the city something no rail line could. It made it famous. A place that the world had watched burn now had its name printed on bottles carried to the far corners of the earth. And then, in 1895, Atlanta did something audacious. It invited the world to come and look at it. The Cotton States and International Exposition opened that September in what is now Piedmont Park. President Grover Cleveland switched on its lights remotely from his home in Massachusetts by closing an electric circuit. Nearly 800,000 people streamed through 6,000 exhibits from 13 nations, and the medal they struck for the fair said everything. It showed a phoenix rising from flames, with the year of the burning written down in the fire, and the year of the fair written above it in the light. 30 years after Sherman, Atlanta was not hiding its ashes. It was selling them. Yet even this proud moment held the same divided soul. On opening day, the educator Booker T. Washington rose to speak and urged Black Americans to set aside the fight for social and political equality and focus instead on earning their way through labor and enterprise. White listeners rose to applaud what came to be called the Atlanta Compromise. Other black leaders, among them D.W.E.B. Du Bois, would condemn it as a surrender. In one square in one park, on one afternoon, you can see the whole shape of Atlanta's future. Dazzling ambition, real achievement, and a bargain with injustice sitting quietly at the center of it all. The forest terminus had become a city that the world flipped a switch to see, but its greatest transformation was still ahead, and it would come, fittingly, from movement. Atlanta had always been a place you passed through. In the 20th century, it turned that fate into dominion. When the age of the automobile arrived, the highways crossed here, just as the railroads had. And when the age of flight arrived, Atlanta reached for the sky with the same instinct that had once laid the tracks. It built an airport, and then it kept building, and the location that had made it the gate city of the rails made it the gateway of the air. Today, that airport, named for two of the city's mayors, one of whom was the first black man to lead it, is the busiest in the world. It has held that title for almost every year since 1998. In a single recent year, more than 106 million travelers moved through it. More people pass through Atlanta now than pass through almost anywhere on the planet, which is exactly what the city was designed from its very first stake to do. Think about what that means for a moment. The single fact that once made Atlanta worth burning, that everything and everyone had to pass through it, is now the engine of its wealth. The city never had to change its nature. It only had to wait for the world to invent faster ways of moving, and then stand exactly where it had always stood, at the crossing point. The forest terminus and the global airport are the same idea, separated by 150 years and a great deal of steel. Atlanta simply kept being the end of the line until the line reached everywhere. And the businesses followed the movement, the way they always had. The airline that runs that airport, Delta, is headquartered here. So is Coca-Cola still. So is the home improvement giant born in 1978, and the shipping empire that moves the world's packages. The metropolitan area is home to 17 of the Fortune 500. The city that Grady dreamed of, a southern capital of commerce rather than cotton, exists now in glass and steel, and it dominates the economy of the region as thoroughly as any city dominates any region in America. It is, by any fair measure, the commercial capital of the South. So return with me, for a moment, to that ridge in the forest. There is a stake in the ground marking the end of a railroad that barely exists yet, in a clearing carved from land taken from people who were forced to leave. There is no ocean. There is no river worth the name. There is no reason on earth for a great city to stand here. And yet everything came from this point. The gate city and the arsenal, the fire and the 40% that fell, the phoenix and the word resurgence, the syrup in the pharmacy and the switch in Massachusetts, the highways and the runways and the 106 million souls a year. Atlanta is often called a city with no memory, a place that tears down its past to build its future, that would rather rise again than remember what it rose from. And there is truth in that. But there is also this. Twice now, Atlanta has been given every reason to disappear, and twice it has answered by building something larger on the ruins of what it lost. That is the whole of the city in a single motion. Loss, and then more, and the two of them forever braided together, so that you cannot celebrate the one without touching the other. The bird burns, the bird rise, and the ashes are always still there, underneath the glass, if you know to look for them. If this is the kind of history you want more of, told with the weight left in, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. There are other cities and other fires and other things built on top of what came before.